And now on the line is Eunan McKinney, the Head of Communications and Advocacy with Alcohol Action Ireland. Eunan, welcome to the programme.
Darren, thanks very much for having me on.
Eunan, I last spoke to you in the RFM early last month about a report yourselves and Alcohol Action Ireland brought out in conjunction with another couple of organisations, which was about the high frequency of alcohol ads during the last Six Nations rugby. We're doing this interview today because I understand that there have been a couple of developments in your work and in relation to the whole area of public health alcohol policy in Ireland since our last interview. Could you tell our listeners, Eunan, what has happened since our last interview early last month?
Well, what has happened is that another section of the Act, which is the Public Health Alcohol Act, which was passed in 2018, another section of that, two sections of it, in fact, have come into play or come into force. And so what we have now is a situation where Section 15 and Section 16 of the Act are legally operational, and what that looks like is that it puts in place a prohibition of alcohol advertising and promotion on the area and in the area of sports. So people are, you referenced the rugby championship there, the Six Nations championship, and people would be familiar with that probably in the context that there's a leading alcohol brand that sponsors that particular championship. And so their brand and their promotion features very heavily on the pitch and on the ball and on the goalposts and on the flag posts and on a variety of pieces that are in the area of the sports. And the reason they do that is because, from a branding point of view and from a brand relationship point of view with a new audience or with existing audiences, what they want to do, what the brand is trying to do, is to ensure that it's seen at the very heart of the sporting activity, at the very heart of the sporting success and the emotional drive that there's involved for us as we watch these sports. So what the Act does is it takes that away, and in the context of the report that you outlined that we published last September, what you would see in a normal circumstance is that at least 50% of the alcohol references that were accumulated or were calculated in that frequency analysis, that they would no longer be on the page. So that's a really progressive move that we've now been able to recognize that this type of what we regard as pernicious marketing of alcohol at the heart of sporting activity is now going to be taken away. And it's not just on episodes like rugby or soccer or GAA. It's also things like racing. So you will no longer be able to have alcohol brands advertised with hurdles of a national hunt race, for example. So it's all sports. So it's whether it be a cricket pitch or whether it be a racetrack or a dog track or whatever the case may be, you just won't be able to advertise in or on the sporting area, and that's a really important development that has taken place. And in addition to that, then what Section 15 says is that you can't advertise alcohol at a sports event or any other event that is focused at children, and that's a positive thing as well. And then the final thing is that on the sponsorship side, it's not a huge thing, but it's kind of more about a principle more than anything else. It just says that alcohol companies cannot sponsor both events that are predominantly attended by children or that are for children, and additionally, motor racing. Any issue of motor racing cannot take alcohol sponsorship. So they're in summary are the two events that have occurred.
Okay. And I believe as regards sports and alcohol policy, you're calling for more, and you carried out an opinion poll recently, didn't you?
We did, and so what we're trying to do now is there are still 4 or 5 significant measures in the Act that have yet to be implemented, and so the major one in the context of the sporting thing, for example, is that we know from Broadcasting Authority of Ireland data that 7 of the top 10 events for children are sports events. And so we know that alcohol advertising is predominantly around those events, and they are largely held during the day. And so in the Act, in Section 19 of the Act, there's a thing called a broadcast watershed, which essentially would ensure that alcohol advertising isn't placed on television or radio before 9 o'clock at night. And so if that was operational, coupled with what has already come into place around the sports area, you could see that there would be a significant transformation in relation to the environment that children are exposed to in relation to alcohol marketing. And that's what it's all about. These measures are all about trying to shift the future generation away from alcohol and act as a, I suppose, degree of a curb on demand for alcohol into children.
Okay, has the Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, given a commitment, Eunan, as to when this measure of a watershed on the media will be broadcast?
No, unfortunately not. So again, what we were doing with the polling that we published yesterday is to try and encourage the Minister and to demonstrate to the Minister that really there's a very strong public support for the measures. So the 3 questions we asked in the opinion poll was, were you in favour of a watershed, a broadcast watershed at 9 o'clock at night? And largely 70% of people said they were in favour of that, with only about 10% and less than 10% of people actually opposed to it. The second question that we asked was very much around, are you concerned about what your children are hearing and seeing in relation to alcohol advertising? And of course, again, a similar level, 78% of people were in that context. And then finally, the social media, concerns around displaying of alcohol advertising and promotion on social media. 2 out of 3 people were very concerned about that and felt that it should be controlled. So what we're trying to do as an advocacy group around these measures is to try and all the time to convince the Minister that, we're now 3 years down the line. It's well over 1,100 days since that Act has been passed, and these measures haven't been commenced. And what we're saying is, look, you have public support for this. You are on solid ground. Proceed and get on with this, and let's get this thing done, because it's only when all of the measures and we've had this conversation before, it's only when all of the measures are in place will we begin to see the effectiveness of the historical piece of work that is the Public Health Alcohol Act.
Okay, I won't keep you much longer, Eunan. I just wanted an update off you today for NARFM. Like, when this measure, assuming when it gets brought in, I think it's going to make a big difference to you, because there's not going to be alcohol advertisements allowed on television or radio.
Oh yeah. It would make a really big difference. And obviously, its endeavour is about trying to protect children, but it will make a big difference in relation to stimulating demand around adult population as well, because there's about 14 million spent annually on alcohol advertising on television. Now, that's not been spent willy-nilly. It's not been spent just for the fun of it. It's been spent for a very good reason, in so much that it supports what is a really big, we've spoken about this before, essentially, we spend in this country nearly 7.5 billion euros on alcohol. And about 3.5 billion of that is from your local off-licensed supermarket, convenience stores. So there's significant and huge money involved, and so it's well worth our while to spend 14 million in television advertising. But if we want to move to a situation in a society where we're endeavouring to try and ensure that the next generation isn't caught in the same level of a trap around alcohol that our forefathers or our parents are, well, then we're going to have to do something about it, and that's what this is endeavouring to do.
And does it include, when it comes in, social media?
No, it doesn't, unfortunately. But what does include it in social media is another section of the Act, which is Section 13, and that's a really big issue and probably needs longer time now than you have. But what it essentially does is it transforms how alcohol advertising is produced, how it's created. At the moment, producers and creative people around alcohol advertising have the whole access to the whole range of human emotions around love, success, sex, whatever the case may be, in relation to alcohol. And so what this does is it makes sure that in the future all alcohol advertising becomes a very utilitarian type of explain. In other words, it would be just focused on, here is the product, here's the price, here's what it tastes like, here's where it was made, and nothing else. And so that's a really important part of a very long-term view on how we transform the engagement around alcohol. But unfortunately, that section hasn't been commenced either.
Okay, to come towards the end of the interview, Eunan, I just thought of something there that I didn't plan to ask and I'd forgotten about, but I know your CEO, Sheila Gilheeney, was on News Talk recently. I didn't hear her actually, but she was talking about, I think one thing she was talking about was comments Joe Biden made talking to the Pope recently, and the headline on the podcast was that in Ireland, 15% of people have an alcohol use disorder.
Yeah,
I find that extraordinary that it's the high. Well. In a way I do. In other ways I don't.
yes,
Find it surprising.
yes,
But
yes.
I think as well. Like if it's 15% for the country, like in some places it's probably 25%. In other places probably 5%. Do you agree?
Well, yeah. Well, to a degree. I mean, generally speaking, alcohol use is classless. It doesn't fall into one particular community or one particular place. I mean, wealthy people drink just as much as poor people drink, and so country people drink as much as urban people do. So I don't think there's any particular pockets where one is more pronounced than the other. The issue really is what's really the issue here is that if you take the totality of our use of alcohol in Ireland, we actually do reasonably well in terms of people who don't drink at all. It's about 1 in 4 people who actually don't drink at all. But the other 3/4 that do drink, which is about 2.6, 2.7 million people, at least half of those do so in a particularly harmful way. And this is our difficulty, our persistent difficulty with things like binge drinking and what we're doing about binge drinking. And minimum unit pricing is going to come in the 4th of January, and that will make some headway in relation to those particular issues. But yes, I mean, the HRB data looks at the national survey in relation to alcohol and drug use in 2019. They looked at the level of use, and when you do the maths, you come up with a figure of 578,000 people who have a drinking pattern which is consistent with an alcohol use disorder. Now, an alcohol use disorder has a spectrum in it. Some are mild, some are moderate, but quite a lot are severe. And so any country that's allowing a situation whereby its citizens are, 1 in 6 of its citizens are largely going around in a particular impact in relation to alcohol isn't a particularly productive or creative society, I would argue.
And when it's called an alcohol use disorder, I believe that this is something I didn't know when I drank years ago, and I think a lot of people still don't know it nowadays. But alcoholism is an illness, but defined by the WHO, or stroke. When I say illness, another word for that is disease. Like it is actually an illness, isn't it? Addiction to alcohol.
Well, any addiction is an illness. It's a psychological illness in many ways more than anything else. But what alcohol use disorders is about is essentially, there's a spectrum of 11 different activities. And so, if you find yourself unable to resist alcohol, and obviously if you're dependent on alcohol, you're at the more severe end of it. But there are a whole range of activities in between, like where perhaps you haven't been able to go to work, or where you haven't been able to get up in the morning, or perhaps where you haven't been able to bring the kids to soccer training, or whatever the case may be. So there is a range that's in there, but that's impacting on your lives. And the reality of all of that, sadly, yet again, is the recognition. We do have to recognize that those of us who are drinking in Ireland, tend to be in the situation, or at least half of it where we're just simply drinking too much, too often. And we really do need to get to grips with that too much, too often. If we can drink that bit less and less often, we're going to have much better outcomes in relation to our health, our physical well-being, and our mental well-being.
And the Public Health Alcohol Act, when it's implemented fully, I think personally it will make a very big difference over time. Like if you look at the smoking ban, it's not exactly comparable.
There's no question about it. There's no question about it. It absolutely is going to make a difference. And we can see already, in terms of even some of the early data, that there has been, certainly there are indications that as a nation we are beginning to, the penny is beginning to drop in relation to, and so it should. We've essentially been advocating around this issue for nearly a decade at this point. So, we should be making some progress. And thankfully, yes, we are making some progress, I think, and I think we'll see that next year is going to be a really important year in that respect, because we'll have the full year of the measures, especially around the structural separation, the ending of all the bonus points. Some of the advertising measures will be in place, and crucially, we'll have the minimum unit price in place. And, by the end of 2022, I hope that we'll be able to have a conversation where we're able to say, look, we're making real progress towards our target, which is, of course, to bring about a 20% reduction in alcohol use across society.